Deep in a frozen wilderness, a man stumbled upon a tiny, shivering ball of fur, left to die. But what happened next would change both their lives forever. The wind howled like a wounded beast as snowflakes stung Jake's face. He tightened his coat, trudging through the Alaskan wilderness, his breath forming icy clouds. He was a loner, a hunter who preferred the company of trees over people. But today, the forest had a different plan for him. A weak whimper cut through the storm. Jake froze. Was an animal? He followed the sound, heart pounding, until he saw it. A tiny brown bear cub curled up beside its lifeless mother, a victim of a poacher's bullet. The cub's ribs showed through its thin fur, its eyes dull with hunger and fear. This was no ordinary bear, and saving it would lead Jake down a path he never expected. Against every survival instinct, Jake knelt. The cub flinched, but was too weak to run. Jake's gloved hand hovered, then gently scooped it up. "All right, little fighter, you're coming with me." Back in his cabin, Jake warmed milk and fed the cub drop by drop. It coughed, then latched onto the bottle with a desperation that tugged at Jake's hardened heart. He named him Thor, after the god of thunder, because this cub had survived a storm no creature should endure. But raising a wild bear in secret, that was just the beginning of the danger. Weeks passed. Thor grew stronger, clumsier, chewing Jake's boots and knocking over furniture. Jake knew he should release him, but every time he tried, Thor would whine and cling to his leg like a scared puppy. Then one night, Jake woke to a low growl. Thor was standing rigid, staring at the door. A shadow moved outside. Poachers. Jake's blood turned to ice. They'd followed him. They wanted Thor. And that's when Jake realized saving Thor might cost him everything. A man and a bear living as family. But the world wasn't ready for their bond. And soon, the truth would explode in the worst way possible. Jake grabbed his rifle, heart hammering. Outside voices snarled. "We know you got the cub, old man. Hand it over." Thor bared his teeth, a deep rumble in his chest. Jake had never seen him like this, protective, but the cub was no match for armed men. In that moment, Jake made a choice, one that would haunt him for years. He shoved Thor toward the back door. "Run." Thor hesitated, confused. Jake smacked his rump. "Go!" With a startled yelp, Thor bolted into the trees just as the door splintered open. The poachers stormed in, faces twisted in rage. "Where is it?" Jake lied. "Gone. Ran off weeks ago." A fist connected with his jaw. Pain exploded, but Jake grinned through bloody teeth. Thor was safe. But for how long? Because Thor wasn't just any bear, and fate wasn't done with him yet. Years passed. Jake never saw Thor again, though he often left food near the woods, hoping. Meanwhile, reports spread of a massive brown bear terrorizing hunters, one that never attacked humans, only their traps. Then, one autumn morning, Jake found his cabin surrounded by wildlife officers. "Mr. Carter, we have a problem," the lead officer said grimly. "Your bear? He's back." And this time, he wasn't alone. 5 years after their separation, Jake came face to face with the bear he saved. But there wasn't the same cub anymore, and what he did next left everyone speechless. Jake followed the officers into the forest, dread clawing at his throat. Had Thor turned dangerous? Was this how their story ended? With a bullet? Then a twig snapped. A mountain of fur emerged from the trees. Jake's breath caught. Thor, but not the tiny cub. This was a 700-pound beast, muscles rippling, eyes locked onto Jake. Then, the impossible happened. Thor sniffed the air and charged. The officers raised their rifles, but Jake threw himself in front of them. No! The bear skidded to a stop, and licked Jake's face like an overgrown puppy. Silence. Jake laughed, tears streaming. "You remember me, boy?" Thor nuzzled him, whining like he was scolding Jake for leaving. But the shock wasn't over, because Thor hadn't come alone. A rustle in the bushes. Out trotted 3 cubs, Thor's children. The officers gasped. Bears never introduced their young to humans. Never. Yet here they were, sniffing Jake's boots curiously while Thor watched, proud. The lead officer lowered his gun, stunned. "I've never seen anything like this." Jake knelt, letting a cub chew his sleeve. Yeah, Thor's full of surprises. But the biggest surprise? What Thor did next would break the internet and change wildlife laws forever. Jake had raised a bear cub, but now he was face to face with something even more unbelievable: Thor's entire family. And what they did next shattered everything we thought we knew about wild animals. The forest was silent except for the curious snuffling of Thor's 3 cubs as they circled Jake. Their tiny claws scraped against the dirt, their noses twitching as they sniffed his boots. Jake held his breath, afraid to move. One cub, bold and golden-furred, pawed at his leg. Then, in a move that made the wildlife officers gasp, it rolled onto its back, exposing its belly like a trusting dog. This wasn't just a reunion. This was a wild bear teaching his children to trust a human, and the reason why would leave scientists baffled for years. Thor let out a low grunt, as if giving permission. The cubs immediately swarmed Jake, nipping at his sleeves and climbing onto his lap like puppies. Jake laughed, scratching behind their ears. "Well, ain't you just the cutest little monsters?" The lead officer, Daniels, lowered his rifle, stunned. This shouldn't be possible. Bears don't do this." Jake smirked. Thor ain't most bears. But the peace wouldn't last, because someone was watching, and they didn't like what they saw. A twig snapped in the distance. Thor's head whipped around, his fur bristling. A shadowy figure melted back into trees. Jake's blood ran cold. Poachers. They'd followed the officers. And now they knew Thor had cubs, valuable cubs. And when they struck, Jake would learn the terrifying truth. Thor hadn't just come back to say hello. He'd come back for revenge. They thought they could take Thor's family. They were wrong. Dead wrong. Jake spent the next days in a haze of wonder and fear. Thor and his cubs lingered near the cabin, playing in the meadow like they were part of the family. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Then one morning he found the trap, a steel jaw clamp, hidden under leaves near the tree line. Poachers. They were getting bolder. But what they didn't know, Thor was waiting for them. And bears have long memories. That night, Jake was jolted awake by a roar that shook the cabin walls. He grabbed his rifle and burst outside, just in time to see Thor launching himself at 2 masked figures near the tree line. The men screamed, scrambling back. One fired a shot, bang, but Thor didn't stop. He swiped, his claws ripping through the man's jacket like paper. The second poacher turned to run and froze. Standing between him and the forest were Thor's cubs, not playful anymore, growling. In that moment, Jake realized a horrifying truth. Thor hadn't just brought his cubs to meet him, he brought them to hunt. Jake raised his rifle. "Thor, no!" The bear hesitated. The poacher took his chance, bolting into the night. Thor turned to Jake, panting, his eyes burning with something Jake had never seen before: betrayal. And then, without a sound, Thor vanished back into the darkness, taking his cubs with him. Jake had just made the biggest mistake of his life. And the next time they met, it would be in a storm of blood and bullets. A single video changed everything. And when the world saw what Thor could do, no one would ever look at bears or humans the same way again. Jake searched for days, but Thor and the cubs were gone. Then his phone blew up. A video posted by some hiker, titled, Wild Bear Protects Man from Poachers, unreal footage. Jake clicked play, and his stomach dropped. There he was, standing between Thor and the fleeing poacher. The footage showed Thor stopping at Jake's voice, the cubs backing down like trained dogs. The video exploded. 10 million views in a day. Scientists called it a miracle. But the worst part? Now, everyone knew where Thor was. Reporters swarmed Jake's cabin. Wildlife experts demanded answers. And worst of all, the poachers weren't done. A note nailed to Jake's door. "We're coming for your bear. And this time, you won't stop us." Jake had one chance to fix this. But it meant doing the unthinkable and trusting a predator more than his own kind. That night, Jake did something insane. He walked into the forest, alone, and called Thor's name. For an hour, nothing. Then a rustle. Thor emerged, eyes wary. The cubs were gone, hidden somewhere safe. Jake swallowed. "I need your help, boy. They're coming. And this time, we fight together." What happened next would be spoken about for decades. Because when the poachers returned, they didn't find a man or a bear waiting for them. They found a nightmare. The poachers thought they were hunters. That night, they learned the terrible truth. They were the prey. Moonlight bled through the trees as Jake waited, his back pressed against a towering pine. The forest was too quiet. No owls, no rustling leaves, just a heavy silence before a storm. Then, snap, a twig broke 20 yards away. Then another. They were coming. Jake's fingers tightened around his rifle, but he didn't raise it. Not yet, because hidden in the shadows, something far deadlier than a gun was waiting. And when it struck, the forest would run red. A flashlight beam cut through the dark. "Over here," a man hissed. 5 figures crept forward, their faces covered, their hands gripping rifles and tranquilizer guns. They weren't just here to kill Thor. They wanted him alive. Jake's stomach twisted. He knew what that meant, black market buyers. A bear like Thor? He'd be worth a fortune in some twisted underground zoo. But these men had made one fatal mistake. They'd forgotten who they were dealing with. Not just a bear, a father. A low growl rumbled through the trees. The men froze. Then chaos. Thor erupted from the darkness like a living avalanche. His first swipe sent a poacher flying into a tree. The second man screamed as Thor's jaws clamped around his rifle. Crunch, snapping it like a twig. Jake moved. He lunged forward, tackling the third poacher before he could fire. They rolled in the dirt, fists flying. But the real horror? This wasn't even Thor's plan. Because waiting in the trees were his cubs, and they'd learned from the best. A high-pitched snarl echoed, and suddenly, the golden-furred cub leaped from a low branch onto a poacher's back. The man shrieked as tiny claws dug into his shoulders. The last 2 poachers turned to run, straight into the waiting jaws of Thor's other 2 cubs. When the gunshot rang out, Jake realized too late. There had been a 6th man, and this time, the bullet wasn't meant for the bear. The bullet hit Jake square in the chest, and what Thor did next would haunt the poacher's nightmares forever. Bang! White-hot pain exploded in Jake's ribs. He crumpled to the snow, gasping. Warm blood seeped through his fingers. Somewhere, a man laughed. Got him. Then silence. A new sound filled the air. Not a growl, not a roar. A sound so unnatural, it made the hairs on Jake's neck stand. Thor was whimpering. In that moment, the bear became something else. Something ancient. Something no bullet could stop. The poacher who'd shot Jake suddenly found himself face to face with 700 pounds of pure, unfiltered rage. Thor didn't charge. He didn't roar. He just stalked forward, his eyes black pits of fury. The man stumbled back, fumbling for another bullet. Too slow. Thor moved. What happened next? Jake would only remember in flashes. The crack of bones. A scream cut short. The cubs, circling like wolves, herding the last fleeing poacher back toward Thor. But the most shocking thing, Thor didn't kill them. He let them go, and the reason why would change everything. Panting, Thor returned to Jake's side. His massive head nudged Jake's face, whining. Jake coughed blood. "Sockeye, boy, just get help." Then miracles. Thor grabbed Jake's jacket in his teeth and dragged him straight toward the one place Jake had forbidden to ever go, the town. A blood-soaked man, a bear dragging him through Main Street, and the moment that would divide a town between those who saw a monster and those who saw a hero. Dawn broke over Silver Creek as Thor lumbered into town, Jake limp in his jaws. Behind them, a trail of crimson stained the snow. The first witness was old Mrs. Peabody, who dropped her groceries and screamed. Within minutes, the streets were chaos. "It's killing him! Somebody shoot it!" Sheriff Hayes drew his pistol, just as Jake groaned and weakly raised a hand. "Don't!" That's when they saw it. The truth. This was an attack. This was a rescue mission. And Thor wasn't leaving without help. Thor gently set Jake down on the clinic steps, then did something that shattered every myth about wild animals. He knocked on the door, then sat and waited. Inside, Dr. Leah Cooper peered through the blinds and nearly fainted. But the real shock came when she opened that door, because Thor didn't force his way in. He nodded like he understood. Leah dragged Jake inside, her hands shaking. Thor didn't follow. He just watched, his breath fogging the cold air. Then sirens. 3 police cars screeched to a halt, rifles trained on Thor. "Get back, beast!" Thor didn't move. Jake, barely conscious in the clinic cot, rasped one word: "Family!" And with that single word, Thor did the unthinkable. He turned his back on the guns and walked away. But why? The answer would shake the world to its core. A bear on trial for murder, a town divided, and the shocking testimony that would prove wild animals understand justice better than humans. The Silver Creek courthouse was packed beyond capacity. Reporters jammed the hallway, cameras flashing as Sheriff Hayes stood at the podium. "This animal is a danger to society." Hayes slammed his fist on the wooden rail. It attacked 5 men, left 2 hospitalized. In a heavy steel cage at the front of the room, Thor lay motionless, his massive head resting on his paws. His eyes tracked every speaker with eerie intelligence. But then, the defense called their first witness, and with 3 words, she turned the entire trial upside down. Dr. Leah Cooper adjusted her glasses as she took the stand. "I'm a trauma surgeon," she said calmly, "and Thor saved Jake Carter's life." The gallery erupted. The judge banged his gavel. Leah continued over the noise. "That bullet nicked Jake's pulmonary artery. If Thor hadn't dragged him to town, he'd have bled out in 10 minutes. She turned to glare at the sheriff. "So tell me, Sheriff, which one's really the killer here? The bear who saved a man, or the men who shot him?" The answer came from an unexpected source, one of the poachers himself. A side door creaked open. The courtroom gasped as Mark Renshaw, the poacher whose arm Thor had shattered, limped to the stand. His right arm was in a sling, his face pale. I deserve this," he whispered. When the prosecutor tried to object, Mark shouted, "We were going to sell his cubs to a Russian circus." The judge's gavel froze midair. Then came the video evidence. And what it showed would force even the judge to question everything he believed about animals and justice. The courtroom screen flickered to life, and the grainy night vision footage revealed the truth about what really happened in those woods. Prosecutor Williams smirked as he inserted the USB. "This will prove the bear's vicious nature." The video showed the poachers setting traps, but then the timestamp jumped. Now it showed them laughing as they injected a female bear with some clear liquid. That's Thor's mother. Jake croaked from his wheelchair in the gallery. His bandages were still seeping blood. The video continued. The poachers high-fived as the bear collapsed. Then, the cubs appeared. Tiny, helpless. That's when the footage took a dark turn. one that explained why Thor had really come back to Jake after all these years. The camera panned to a truck with Cyrillic lettering. A man in a black ski mask held up 3 fingers. 3 cubs. $3 million. The courtroom went dead silent. Then a new clip. Thor watching from the trees as the poachers loaded his unconscious mother into a truck. The way his body shook wasn't from fear. It was rage. The final clip would change everything. Because it wasn't from that night. It was from 3 weeks earlier. The screen showed Jake's cabin. A younger Thor stood on his hind legs, sniffing at Jake's jacket hanging outside. Then, incredibly, the bear gently pulled the jacket down and carried it into the woods. Dr. Cooper gasped. He was collecting Jake's scent, planning his return. The prosecutor's case collapsed in real time. As the judge prepared to rule, a commotion erupted outside because Thor's cubs had arrived, and what they were carrying proved this was no ordinary animal trial. It was a reckoning. The courtroom doors burst open to reveal the impossible. Thor's cubs, dragging something that shattered the prosecution's case forever. Gasps filled the room as the 3 cubs trotted down the aisle. The golden-furred one held a mangled boot in its teeth. The others dragged a shredded backpack, oozing vials of tranquilizers, and a folded map marked with trap locations. That's our evidence locker. Sheriff Hayes turned white, but the real bomb dropped when the smallest cub spat out a smartphone, and the video it played would send men to prison for decades. The screen flickered to life, showing Sheriff Hayes shaking hands with the poachers. "Just give me the cubs," Hayes whispered on the video. "I'll handle the paperwork." The courtroom exploded. Thor suddenly stood in his cage, pressing his massive paws against the bars. Not to break out, to point straight at Hayes. What happened next wasn't law. It wasn't science. It was something far more ancient, pure justice. The judge removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes. When he spoke, his voice trembled. This court finds that the bear designated Thor acted in defense of both human life and his own family. All charges are dismissed. The crowd roared. Reporters surged forward. But Thor wasn't watching them. His eyes were locked on Jake, who was slumped unconscious in his wheelchair, his bandages now soaked crimson. As Dr. Cooper screamed for medics, Thor did something no wild animal should understand. He reached through the bars and pulled the emergency alarm. Jake was dying, but his final wish wasn't for himself. It was for the bear who would save his life. And what he asked for, no one saw coming. The hospital machines beeped in a slow, ominous rhythm. Jake's skin was gray, his breathing shallow. Dr. Cooper bit her lip as she checked his vitals. The infection from the gunshot had spread too far. Thor knew. The massive bear sat outside the hospital window, his breath fogging the glass. The townspeople had stopped trying to shoo him away. They'd all seen the way his huge shoulders shook when Jake coughed. Then Jake whispered something to Dr. Cooper, and the moment she heard it, she knew she had to break every rule in the book. "Bring him in," Jake rasped. Leah's hands froze. "Jake, he's a wild bear." Jake's cracked lips curled into a smile. "He's family." The hospital staff held their breath as Leah opened the window. Thor didn't charge in. He ducked his head low and crept forward like a nervous guest, his claws clicking softly on the tile. What happened next would be remembered in Silver Creek forever, because Thor didn't just visit Jake. He said goodbye. The bear nuzzled Jake's limp hand, whining deep in his throat. Then, impossibly, he laid his massive head on Jake's chest, right over his heart. A nurse gasped. "He's listening to his heartbeat." Jake's trembling fingers sank into Thor's fur one last time. "Take care of him, boy," he whispered. And as the sun set, painting the room gold, everyone saw it. A single tear rolling from Thor's dark eye onto Jake's hospital gown. But this wasn't the end, because when Jake took his final breath, Thor roared, a sound so full of grief it shook the walls. And that's when the real mystery began. Jake was gone. But Thor, he was just getting started, and the bizarre sightings that followed proved the story was far from over. The morning after Jake's death, the townspeople woke to something impossible. Every poaching trap within 50 miles had been destroyed, not just sprung, smashed into twisted metal, each one marked with deep claw grooves. Sheriff Hayes found the first one with a chilling addition. Jake's old hunting knife stabbed through its center, the handle wrapped in birch bark. Then came the reports from truckers of a massive bear shadowing the highway at night, always just beyond the headlights. And stranger still, he wasn't alone. 3 little shapes trailed behind him. Over the next months, the legend grew. A group of lost hikers swore a bear led them to safety, then vanished. Hunters found their stolen gear neatly piled by a stream, untouched. And on the anniversary of Jake's death, his gravesite was covered in fresh wildflowers and giant paw prints. But the final proof came from a wildlife camera, one that captured an image so shocking it went viral worldwide. The photo showed Thor standing upright by Jake's grave, his paw resting on the headstone. Beside him, the 3 cubs, now nearly full-grown, each held something in their mouths. A faded photo of Jake, his old compass, and a single perfect salmon. The newspaper headline said it all: not a bear, a guardian. But the most incredible part? This wasn't the end, because 10 years later it happened again. A decade after Jake's death, a little girl wandered into the woods. What she found there proved some bonds never die. They just wait for the right moment to return. 7-year-old Emma Carter, Jake's granddaughter, shouldn't have been in the forest alone, but she'd seen the pictures, heard the stories. And today, on the anniversary of Grandpa Jake's passing, she had to see for herself. The snapping twig made her whirl around. There, between the trees, stood the biggest animal she'd ever seen. But the bear didn't attack. He sniffed the air, then did something that made Emma's babysitter faint when she finally found them. Thor, now old, his muzzle gone gray, lowered himself onto his belly and crawled toward her, whining softly. Emma, somehow unafraid, reached out. The bear's wet nose brushed her palm, then nudged a tiny bear charm on her necklace, the one from Grandpa Jake's will. That's when the truth hit Emma. This wasn't just any bear, and the 3 shadows moving in the trees behind him were his children, still watching, still protecting. As Emma buried her fingers in Thor's fur, the old bear let out a contented huff. Then, with surprising gentleness, he stood and guided her back toward town, walking slowly so she could keep up. At the forest edge, he stopped. Emma turned back once and swore she saw not 1, but 4 shapes watching her from the trees. The 4th was taller, wearing a familiar flannel shirt. Then the wind blew and they were gone. And to this day, if you listen closely in Alaskan woods, you might hear it. The distant sound of bears' happy chuff, and a man's laughter echoing right back. This story proves love isn't just a human emotion. It's wild, it's fierce, and it never forgets. But now I want to hear from you. What moment hit you hardest? Was it Thor's tear? The courtroom scene? Let me know in the comments. Do you think animals understand love and loss like we do? Debate below. Should I track down Emma for an update? She's 17 now. Imagine the stories she could tell. Smash that like button if you cried. I won't judge. And subscribe, because stories like this, they're why I do what I do. Until next time, stay wild.